With me now is his friend and colleague, Jeremy Bowen, a well-known BBC correspondent who himself had to deal with bowel cancer, I think, 4 years ago. Jeremy, thank you very much for coming in. And we'll talk about your experience in just a moment. But, George, it was diagnosed too late. I guess you knew this was coming.
Yeah, well, of course, and he knew, everybody knew, that however good the doctors are, if the cancer has spread, it's a matter of getting the right quality of life that you can have, the right mental attitude, which George definitely had, and time and hoping for the best. And, you know, he lived for 9 years after his diagnosis. I think the figure is the 5-year diagnosis for his kind of stage 4 cancer. The survival rate is about 10%. So he did, you know, he beat the odds. However, as he would have said, it was going in one direction, and that's why he was so evangelical about getting tested if you have any dodgy symptoms.
But I guess the advanced state of the cancer when he was diagnosed is a sobering lesson for all of us.
Yeah. I mean, he had symptoms. He talked about this. I'm not giving anything away. He had symptoms which he explained away, he rationalised. He'd lost weight. Well, I'm trying to keep fit. I'm eating more veg, that kind of thing. But in fact, it took when he started seeing blood. And the thing about bowel cancer is people sometimes get a little bit reluctant, a bit embarrassed to talk about it because it involves poo, it involves backsides, all these kind of things which, you know, we tend not to mention in polite conversation. Yeah. But actually, if anything goes wrong in your toilet activities over a period of more than a few weeks, you need to go and talk to someone. And if you get those a little kit that people over a certain age get from the NHS, it's like a little test tube with a couple of... You know, like those little sticks you get at the cinema for ice cream. Don't want to put anybody off. No. And you have to dig around and send off a sample. Yeah. And they can pick up microscopic amounts of blood that way. And then you have a good chance of being treated when there's time. Because when there is time, you can live.
Well, I was looking at some statistics today which said that 30% of people who get those kits that you were just talking about for bowel cancer screening completely ignore them.
Well, guys, don't do it because it could be your life at stake. It's as simple as that. I had none of the classic symptoms, you know, blood in the loo, losing weight, none of those things. But I had, and I had 4 years earlier, what's called a virtual colonoscopy, that sort of big scan of my gut, and I had nothing wrong then. And in 4 years, I went from nothing wrong to having a stage 3 tumour. So my tumour was in my bowel, and it was also in some of my lymph nodes.
So what made you go and get tested?
Well, I had some pains, and I wasn't sure, and there was a little bit of a family history, not enough for the doctors to get too worked up about. And I was working in Iraq, and I had this awful, and then in India, I had these very nasty pains, and they put it down to something else. But then I went to my GP and said, look, I'd like to get a test in case. She said, all right, fair enough. Give us a sample of your poo. I left it on the receptionist's desk, neatly labelled. And a few weeks later, they called me up and said, look, we found microscopic amounts of blood. And initially they said, don't worry, it's very early days. But actually it was really quite advanced. I had to have surgery. I had 8 rounds of chemo over 6 or 7 months. I was really quite ill. And luckily, I had done that test. If I hadn't done that test, I might not be here.
And what did they say about that? If you'd have left it, because you were talking earlier about how these things can change, polyps can grow very quickly.
Well, it was already...
If you hadn't have done that test, you'd have been...
Well, it was already in 2 or 3 of my lymph nodes. Yeah. Next stage would have been to go, like with poor old George, into my liver, perhaps. And so I had to have quite big surgery, plus a lot of chemotherapy to try and knock out any cancer cells that were around. And I've got regular colonoscopies, which is it sounds much worse than it actually feels because they give you some good drugs. They put
I had one last week,
a tube up your backside with a camera on it.
I do.
And it's quite an interesting experience. But I have them every 6 months now.
Do you?
I'm going to have annual ones at least for my
Because
lifetime.
you might have a tendency to
I develop polyps
and growth.
Yeah,
in your colon.
sometimes they harvest about 10 of them, chop them out. Some would have turned into cancer had they been left. But because I have this regular screening, they get them before they develop into anything sinister.
Now, George said what I read, and I thought this is an extraordinary thing. He said that near the end, he said this. He said, obviously, I didn't want cancer, which goes without saying. But there was this positive side, he said, in the sense of reappraising his life and what he had achieved. I just wonder, I mean, do you understand that?
Yeah, I do. And, you know, I'm not comparing the situations because he had a stage 4 diagnosis. Mine was not as serious. Fingers crossed, I'm going to be okay. I'm nearly in 5 years in remission. You know, never say never, but I hope that's the case. And, you know, I think being faced with a potentially terminal illness is something that does make you prioritise. And I had got a bit tied up in the negativity of aspects of being in my midlife, you might say, I suppose. And actually, the old, positive, optimistic Jeremy, I think, was quite revived by having had to go through all of this. I had a lot of support from George. You know, he came down to my house. He gave me a packet of the Alagiah family secret recipe curry powder. Wouldn't give me the recipe. He gave me the delicious spice mix.
Yeah.
You know, we chatted on the phone, we'd text and things like that, and meet occasionally, you know, comparing notes. Of course, I got away with so much less in terms of treatment.
But your message and his message, I mean, it's the same, get checked.
Yeah, and if you get sent that kit, for God's sake, use it. Don't be an idiot. You're an idiot if you chuck it away, because you could save your own life.
Yeah, and just finally, Jeremy, a quick word about George, broadcaster, foreign correspondent, friend of yours.
Yeah, well, I met him on his first day at the BBC. He turned up, and another colleague, David Shuckman, and I, we showed him around BBC Television Centre, where we still were, and took him to the canteen and that sort of thing. And he was clearly a very nice guy. But then it emerged quite quickly he was actually a very good reporter as well. And then what followed was a very, very distinguished career.
Jeremy, thank you very much for coming in. Points very well made, and let's hope people heed that advice. Thank you very much for coming in. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.